Hollywood coroner says an overdose of narcotics, police say possibly heroin, is responsible for the death of the well-known rock singer Janis Joplin. Miss Joplin was found dead in her bedroom last night.
She was only 27, but her impact was eternal. In the 1960s, two voices stood out above all: raw, rebellious, and impossibly electric. They were destined to burn bright, but too fast. On stage, they were untouchable legends. But behind the bright lights, the story took a darker turn. Janis Joplin was known for being wild, unapologetically herself, and unafraid to break every rule in the book. But there was one rock star she couldn't stand: Jim Morrison. And their first meeting, it wasn't just a clash of egos, it was something far more unsettling. For years, whispers circled around their explosive encounter, dismissed as the chaos of rock and roll. But now, shocking details have surfaced that shed light on what really happened between these two icons. Buckle up, because what you're about to hear changes everything. Janis Lynn Joplin came from Port Arthur, Texas, a town where tradition reigned and conformity was the law. Here, standing out was a risk. And Janis, she didn't just stand out, she was an undeniable force. From a young age, Janis was drawn to art, poetry, and music that defied the expectations of young Southern girls. While other kids listened to pop and country, she immersed herself in the soulful sounds of Bessie Smith, Ma Rainey, and Lead Belly, blues artists whose raw emotion and powerful storytelling resonated deeply within her. But Port Arthur didn't just misunderstand her, it actively tried to break her. In school, Janis was relentlessly mocked. Her acne, her fluctuating weight, her tomboy style, everything about her was targeted. The teasing wasn't just casual, it was calculated and cruel, leaving deep scars that would never fully heal. But what truly set her apart was her courage. In a town steeped in segregation, she dared to openly support racial integration, and that only made her a target. Hoping for refuge, Janis enrolled in Lamar State College of Technology and later the University of Texas at Austin, hoping these spaces might finally see her talent, not her differences. That hope, it was crushed. At Austin, the same cruelty she'd experienced in Port Arthur followed her. Known for her performances in coffee houses, barefoot, in men's shirts, with an auto harp in hand, Janis struggled to shake the shadow of judgment. And then, in an act of cruelty that stung like nothing else, a fraternity voted her ugliest man on campus. The pain of being ridiculed and cast out cut deep. But it wasn't the end, it was the fire that would fuel her music. When Janis sang, she didn't just sing. She bared her soul. Her voice trembled with the weight of years of rejection, pouring out raw emotion that only someone who'd known deep pain could channel. Her music wasn't sweet or polished. It was pure, unfiltered truth, something that spoke directly to anyone who'd ever been made to feel less than. It was her weapon, her declaration of defiance. With every note, she was telling the world, "I am here. I am real." But as her personal pain continued, Janis sought comfort in a familiar companion. A comfort that would become both her friend and her undoing. Southern comfort. For Janis, it wasn't just a drink. It was a symbol, a part of her stage persona. With her oversized rose-tinted glasses, boho chic fashion, and a voice that could break hearts, she walked on stage with a bottle of SoCo in hand like it was another instrument. It wasn't just for show. She drank from it like it was her partner in performance. No sips, just swigs, letting the alcohol loosen her nerves and free the raw emotion she poured into every song. Just like Janis, Southern comfort wasn't delicate or refined, it was bold, unapologetic. And yet, Southern comfort wasn't what most thought it was. Often mistaken for whiskey, it was technically a flavored liqueur made from neutral grain spirits, closer to vodka than bourbon. Despite the misunderstanding, the bottle became synonymous with Janis. Whether backstage, on a tour bus, or at a press event, it was always by her side. Her fans, and even the makers of Southern comfort, took note. The drink became part of her brand, and in an unexpected twist, she became its most rebellious and iconic spokeswoman. Without ever receiving a dime, Janis was the face of Southern comfort. In a gesture that was equal parts extravagant and symbolic, the company sent her a full-length lynx fur coat and matching hat, symbols of status in the late 1960s, and, in Janis' hands, a declaration that she would never, ever conform. Janis, who often claimed she never quite felt beautiful, wore the fur coat with undeniable pride. But like so many of the symbols that defined her life, Southern comfort was both her friend and her curse. The same drink that gave her courage before stepping on stage also blurred her boundaries, pulling her deeper into the chaos. Her relationship with alcohol wasn't just a theatrical element. It was entangled with her insecurities, her pain, and the pressure of fame. It numbed the feelings when she didn't quite feel enough. It warmed her when the world around her grew too cold. And eventually, it all caught up with her. Under the weight of countless cocktails, the same habits that fueled her performances led to her early death at just 27. Heartbreaks and lost loves, Janis was seen by the world as a wild, free-spirited icon of the counterculture. But behind the scenes, her love life often reflected a portrait of quiet heartbreak. She craved love just as fiercely as she craved artistic expression, but finding both in the same place seemed impossible. Her relationships were fleeting, intense, and often turbulent, flash fires that left only ashes of disappointment. She dove headfirst into each romance with the same unfiltered energy she poured into her music, but more often than not, she ended up alone. Some lovers admired her brilliance, but couldn't handle her intensity. Others were more attracted to her fame than to her soul. Over and over, she opened herself up, only to face silence, indifference, or betrayal. One of the most emotionally charged moments of Janis' romantic life happened in 1968, when she had a brief encounter with Leonard Cohen at the Chelsea Hotel in New York. Cohen later reflected on it in the haunting lyrics of his song, Chelsea Hotel No. 2. What seemed like a fleeting, insignificant moment for him lingered in Janis' heart for much longer, leaving her aching. Perhaps Janis had been looking for Chris Christopherson that night, but instead settled for whatever company was available, an arrangement that casts a melancholy shadow over the entire affair. Years later, Cohen admitted he didn't quite know how to feel about naming Janis in that song. He realized too late that for her, what he considered an artful moment, was likely something far more intimate and meaningful. That night, like so many others in her romantic life, ended in disillusionment. These heartbreaks didn't just shape her personal life, they seeped into her music. Songs like Piece of My Heart, Cry Baby, and Maybe were more than just tracks. They were confessions, drenched in that aching vulnerability that comes from loving too deeply and not being loved back the way you hoped. It was that very vulnerability that became her trademark. Raw, imperfect, and deeply human. It was this quality that made her voice resonate with anyone who had ever felt the sting of rejection, or the deep yearning for a love that always seemed just out of reach. Behind the fame, the fire, and the fur coat, Janis Joplin was still that Texas girl who longed to be held and never quite believed she was worthy of it. Broken by fame. Fame, in fact, was never meant to heal her. It only magnified what was already broken. Long before the world knew her name, Janis had already started battling substance abuse, using alcohol and amphetamines to numb her internal pain. But when she hit the national stage, first with Big Brother and the holding company, and later as a solo act, her dependency only grew stronger. Heroin, in particular, became a constant in her life. Despite her skyrocketing success, or perhaps because of it, the loneliness and self-doubt that had followed her since childhood grew even more consuming. Those closest to her watched helplessly as the girl who could electrify thousands became more and more isolated off stage. Friendships crumbled under the weight of erratic behavior, and the carefree party lifestyle that once made her feel powerful began to hollow her out. Janis tried to get clean more than once, even returning to her hometown in Texas in the mid-1960s, hoping to break free from the chaos. But the pull of music, and the lifestyle that came with it, was too strong. She returned to California, stepped back into the spotlight, and quickly slipped back into old habits. Though there were moments of hope, they were short-lived. In the final months of her life, she was recording what would become her most celebrated solo album, Pearl, and those closest to her remained optimistic about her future. But behind the scenes, Janis had quietly returned to heroin. On October 4, 1970, just 2 weeks after Jimi Hendrix's death, Janis was found dead in her Hollywood hotel room from a heroin overdose. She was only 27. Her death cemented her place in rock mythology, not just as an extraordinary voice, but as one of the tragic founders of the 27 Club, a group of gifted artists who all died at 27. Janis, forever intertwined with Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, Kurt Cobain, and Amy Winehouse, became a symbol of the high cost of fame and the fragility often hidden behind the glamour of greatness. Her death captivated the public's fascination, but sometimes that overshadowed the complexities of her life. She was anything but a cliché. Far from being just another victim of the turbulent 60s, Janis Joplin was a deeply intelligent, emotionally scarred woman who had something to say. But she said it in a way no one else could. She wasn't just a tragic figure. She was a force of nature, refusing to conform, pouring herself into music in the rawest, most authentic way. The greatest irony of Janis' life was that Pearl, the album she never got to finish, became her most polished and emotionally rich work. Released posthumously in 1971, the album featured timeless hits like Me and Bobby McGee and Mercedes-Benz, songs that captured her wit, vulnerability, and aching clarity. Pearl is now one of the most revered albums in rock history, a haunting reminder of what was lost and what might have been. In the end, Janis Joplin gave everything she had to her music, even if it meant giving up parts of herself. Her voice, extinguished too soon, still resonates through the generations, carrying the passion, pain, and power she poured into every note. Janis, like the blues artists who inspired her, left behind a legacy that no one would ever forget. Janis wasn't just inspired by the blues, she belonged to them. Among all her influences, none loomed larger than Bessie Smith, the legendary African-American vocalist who became known as the Empress of the Blues. Bessie's music hit Janis on a soul-deep level, offering not only artistic guidance but emotional validation that Janis needed most. Growing up in a conservative, white town where she was scorned for her differences, Janis found solace in Bessie's unflinching expressions of sorrow, pain, and power. Janis saw Bessie not just as a role model, but as a spiritual ancestor, someone who gave her permission to cry, scream, and express her innermost self without fear. Janis half-jokingly once said she might be Bessie's reincarnation, as their struggles, though separated by race and decades, were deeply intertwined. Both women were outsiders, both poured heartbreak into their melodies, and both left this world far too soon. Janis became even more personally connected to Bessie when she learned that Bessie had been buried in 1937 without a headstone. Bessie Smith, who had died after being denied medical treatment at a whites-only hospital in Mississippi, had never received the recognition she deserved, despite her immense influence on American music. To Janis, this wasn't just an oversight, it was an injustice. How could one of the most powerful voices in music history be denied such recognition? Furious and determined, Janis took action. In 1970, she co-financed a headstone for Bessie's grave, along with Juanita Green, a woman who had worked with Bessie and knew her personally. Together, they made sure that Bessie's final resting place would be dignified, at long last. The tombstone was simple, yet the inscription struck a powerful chord. That last line wasn't just admiration, it was a statement. To Janis, Bessie's voice had transcended her physical existence, continuing to resonate in the music, in the struggle, and in every woman who dared to be loud, emotional, and unapologetically herself. Honoring Bessie's grave was about more than gratitude, it was about justice. Janis refused to let the world silently bury Bessie, because Janis knew exactly what it felt like to be marginalized and dismissed. By using her fame to ensure Bessie's legacy would not be forgotten, Janis gave voice to a woman whose brilliance had been overshadowed by time and racism. While Janis honored the memory of one blues icon with grace, her encounter with another would leave her furious, and forever changed. The darker side of Jim Morrison. For decades, Jim Morrison has been mythologized as a rock god, a poet, a troubled genius. But recent revelations are forcing fans and historians to reconsider the darker truths buried beneath the legend. In the upcoming 2025 docuseries Before the End, Searching for Jim Morrison, voices from Morrison's inner circle finally speak out about his erratic, and often terrifying, behavior. What is uncovered will shape the way we view the myth of Morrison, shedding light on the uncomfortable truths that were hidden behind his charismatic, chaotic persona. Chief among the voices coming forward is Judy Huddleston, a former girlfriend of Jim Morrison, who makes a harrowing allegation of sexual exploitation during their relationship. Her testimony paints a chilling picture of a man whose moments of tender charm could rapidly shift into violent rage. According to Huddleston, Morrison once pinned her down and assaulted her, despite her repeated and forceful refusals. She described the moment simply, saying, "He just went psycho." Her vivid recollection of Morrison's demeanor, his eyes turning black with fury, paints a portrait of a man consumed by something far darker than mere substance-fueled recklessness. Huddleston's relationship with Morrison spanned 4 years, starting in the late 1960s when they met backstage at a concert. In interviews and her memoir Love Him Madly, she reflects on the emotional manipulation she endured, describing how Morrison kept her close without ever fully committing. She held on to the hope that she could change him, unaware of the emotional toll it was taking on her. It was only later that she came to the heartbreaking realization that what she had endured wasn't romantic torment, it was psychological and physical abuse. Morrison's allure came, in part, from his volatility. But behind the mystique of his stage persona and his lyrics, there was a man who, according to multiple accounts, wielded control through fear and intimidation. Several women in Morrison's life have spoken of violent encounters. Pamela Des Barres, another prominent figure in the 1960s rock scene, recalls Morrison slapping her across the face for no apparent reason at Whiskey A Go-Go. John Densmore, drummer for The Doors and Morrison's closest musical collaborator, recalled witnessing Morrison holding a knife to a woman and grabbing her arms. These long-ignored stories, once dismissed as part of rock and roll excess, now carry a much darker weight in the context of today's cultural reckoning around power and accountability. Morrison's self-destructive behavior didn't just damage him, it wreaked havoc on those around him, especially the women in his life. The new light being cast on these events adds a chilling dimension to these testimonies. They force us to reconsider every previous chapter of Morrison's life, especially his infamous encounter with Janis Joplin. For years, their clash was told as a wild, whiskey-soaked rock and roll anecdote, a brief and chaotic moment when two legends collided in a frenzy of egos and energy. Now, though, that story is viewed through a much darker lens. Janis's alleged response to Morrison's advances, grabbing a bottle of Southern Comfort, wasn't diva theatrics. It was an act of self-defense. What she faced wasn't just rock and roll madness, it was part of a disturbing pattern of behavior from Morrison that is only now being fully acknowledged. Morrison may still be celebrated as an icon of 1960s rebellion, but his legacy is increasingly complicated. What once seemed like the glamorous myth of a misunderstood rock god is now overshadowed by the far more troubling reality of his actions and their consequences. Their first meeting was like something out of a rock and roll fairy tale, or at least the kind Hollywood would dream up. Paul Rothschild, the legendary music producer who worked with both The Doors and Janis Joplin, saw an opportunity for magic. He envisioned an unforgettable connection between the so-called king and queen of rock, Jim Morrison and Janis Joplin. Both were powerful forces in the counterculture universe, and Rothschild believed their meeting would create thrilling chemistry. So, he arranged a gathering in Hidden Hills, a secluded spot far enough from the chaos of LA to feel intimate but close enough to attract the right kind of energy. Janis and Jim arrived sober, which was rare for either of them during that time. At first, it seemed like pure magic. Jim was immediately captivated by Janis, calling her remarkable. And Janis, just as intrigued, was drawn to his looks, swagger, and fame. The night unfolded with shared laughter, conversation, and what seemed like genuine curiosity. But in a world built on volatility, the spark didn't ignite passion, it ignited a fuse. As the evening wore on, Morrison's infamous drinking habits caught up with him. What began as a flirtation quickly soured. Jim, who had earned a notorious reputation for drinking himself into oblivion, began to transform into the version of himself that even his closest friends couldn't stand. Rothschild, who had seen this kind of behavior countless times, later described Morrison's transformation as shifting from a charming, charismatic man into a cretin and a disgusting drunk. Janis, in contrast, was a different kind of drinker. She could be rowdy, yes, but her intoxication was warm and charismatic, endearing to those around her. As Jim's behavior grew more aggressive, Janis became visibly unsettled. The more she tried to pull away, the more he pushed, almost as if he thrived on her rejection. Rothschild, hoping for a historic moment between two legends, quickly realized the situation was spiraling out of control. When it became clear there was no connection between them, Janis decided to leave, heading for her station wagon. As they prepared to drive away, Morrison staggered over, drunkenly grabbing a fistful of her hair. That was the breaking point. Without hesitation, Janis swung her bottle of Southern Comfort at him, shattering it against his head. Morrison collapsed, knocked unconscious. For Janis, it was a moment of clarity and defiance. She wasn't anyone's conquest. That night, what began as an awkward party escalated into one of the most explosive personal confrontations in rock history. Rothschild had hoped for a connection between the so-called king and queen of rock, but as the night wore on, Morrison's darker side emerged. Known for his reckless drinking and combative behavior, he wasn't just pursuing Janis, he was aggressively cornering her. Janis, already wary, tried to leave, but Morrison followed, yanking her hair in a final, desperate move. In that instant, Janis, fed up, grabbed her bottle of Southern Comfort and smashed it over his head. The glass shattered, and Morrison crumpled to the ground. Janis, unapologetically defiant, sat behind the wheel of her car, having made a clear statement, she would not be controlled. This wasn't just a rejection, it was a raw declaration of independence. What makes this moment even more telling is that Morrison never seemed to grasp the weight of what had just occurred. The next day, Rothschild recalled, Jim showed up to rehearsals, still asking for Janis's number and praising her in his usual disjointed way. To him, the violent altercation was just another chaotic story, but for Janis, it was a turning point. From then on, Janis made her disdain for Morrison clear. She never spoke of it publicly, but those close to her knew the bottle wasn't just glass, it was a boundary. When Morrison crossed it, she made sure he understood. This wasn't the only time Janis stood up to him. Another time at the Scene nightclub in Manhattan, she allegedly hit Morrison with a bottle after he acted out during a Hendrix performance, drenching him with her drink. It turned into a surreal scene of broken glass and chaos, a bizarre and defiant moment in rock history. For Janis, Morrison represented everything she opposed: entitlement, aggression, and toxic male behavior that she had spent her life fighting. What began as intrigue had turned into disgust. Janis didn't just leave the party that night. She left with a verdict, knowing she wouldn't let herself be treated like one of Morrison's conquests. Janis didn't just fade into obscurity, she channeled her pain and anger into unforgettable music. Her legacy was built not on technical perfection, but on the raw emotion she poured into every performance. In a world where women were expected to be sweet and small, Janis dared to be loud, messy, and real. Her voice became the anthem for anyone who had ever felt unseen or unheard. Even 50 years after her death, Janis remains a cultural giant, not just for her talent, but for her audacity to be herself in a world that tried to strip her of her worth. Her story is a warning about the cost of unchecked pain, but also a celebration of the power of being true to oneself. Through every scream and cracked note, Janis left behind a legacy of rebellion, truth, and raw beauty. Her story still matters because it still hurts.